Nothing to say, it's playing, right?
Everybody ready? Great. Good morning. Since the moment I became Attorney General, my mission has been clear. I believe every Kentucky family ought to be able to live in a safe neighborhood and have a real path to prosperity. A safe neighborhood is not only a neighborhood free from violence, but free from drugs. And we know that a path to prosperity becomes difficult or sometimes impossible when facing addiction or growing up in a broken home. From day one, I've dedicated myself in this office to finding solutions to Kentucky's devastating opioid epidemic and to hold opioid manufacturers and distributors accountable. Since that time, this office has provided over $8 million of funding for 15 drug treatment centers across Kentucky. We've provided $2 million for drug courts to operate the Rocket Docket. We've launched the Kentucky Opioid Disposal Program, announced a Dropbox partnership with CVS, cracked down on rogue doctors and rogue Suboxone clinics. We've hosted numerous community drug forums throughout this Commonwealth, and thus far, we have filed 4 lawsuits against opioid manufacturers and distributors for helping to fuel our drug epidemic. I'm proud of my team. Our work is important. But we cannot and we will not stop fighting for our families. Today, we are filing suit against Johnson & Johnson and its subsidiaries, Janssen Pharmaceuticals and Ortho McNeil, for their deceptive marketing practices, promoting their opioid drugs, Duragesic and Nucenta ER. These companies created a campaign of misinformation designed to mislead patients and doctors about both the severity and the frequency of the risk of addiction of these strong opioids. In fact, until recently, Janssen ran a website called prescriberresponsibility.com that claimed concerns about opioid addiction were overestimated. That is shameful. Every day, more than 4 Kentuckians die from a fatal overdose. From 2012 to 2016, Kentucky experienced 5,800 fatal overdoses. That's 5,800 friends, family members, neighbors, people who are loved and people who are missed that are no longer with us. I don't think anyone is overestimating the impact of the opioid epidemic. There is no overestimating the devastation that addiction caused by these pills has caused to our communities. The companies told doctors and patients that their opioid medications were safer, that other alternatives were more dangerous, and that opioids were rarely addictive when being used to treat chronic pain. Even worse, they targeted elderly patients knowing they had a higher risk of addiction, hospitalization, and death. The complaint that we're providing called Finding Relief Pain Management for Older Adults. It was put out there for people and doctors to read. It talks about myths, claiming opioid medications are always addictive is a myth, and Janssen claiming the real fact is many studies show that opioids are rarely addictive when used properly for the management of chronic pain. Again, shameful statements and advertising that fueled addiction. While they falsely promoted their products, opioid prescriptions in Kentucky skyrocketed. From 2006 to 2015, Kentucky had more opioid prescriptions than it has people. Janssen profited from their false marketing scheme that put Kentuckians at risk and contributed to the drug epidemic we face today. This morning, we join Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Missouri, New Mexico, Ohio, Oklahoma, and South Dakota in suing Janssen. Today's action is the 5th lawsuit we have taken and filed against opioid manufacturers and distributors. I keep my promises, and I will continue to hold the companies that have profited in the billions fueling our drug epidemic accountable. These companies have made billions. It's their responsibility to provide millions to help us dig out. And because they won't take that responsibility, we're going to drag each and every one of them that knew how powerful and addictive these drugs were, but marketed them as safe. We're going to haul each and every one of those into a Kentucky courtroom and make them answer to our families. I'm happy to take any questions. Tom?
General, why McCracken Circuit Court?
I think that it's first, when filing suit, especially against an out-of-state corporation, there have to be a certain number of contacts with the community, and there are those contacts here between Johnson & Johnson, Janssen, and McCracken County. But I believe it's important to file these lawsuits all over Kentucky because every community has been devastated by the opioid epidemic. McCracken County has some of the highest prescriptions per person in western Kentucky. It's where we launched our opioid disposal pilot project program in western Kentucky along with Henderson. And I believe that we need one of these suits in every region so that the families of western Kentucky can look these companies in the eye and make them explain themselves.
For those of us who were caught in the Louisville traffic jam, could you
Yes.
review the deceptive marketing practices you were
Yes.
referring to?
Janssen, which is a subsidiary of Johnson & Johnson, in promoting 3 opioid products, talked about them being rarely addictive, and put out publications especially aimed at seniors that made them think that these opioid medications could be safe. It's shameful. It's fueled addiction. It's caused the death of thousands of Kentuckians. And the claim by Janssen that the harms of opioids had been overestimated is just shameful.
Can you talk about any specific impact that this has had in Kentucky?
Well, you see the impact in the overall impact. You see losing 5,800 Kentuckians since 2006, of losing 4 Kentuckians every single day. This opioid epidemic, fueled by Janssen and others, is the challenge of our times. It's the single largest challenge to the lives of Kentuckians, but it's also the single greatest challenge to our families. We have more broken families right now because of this epidemic than ever in our history. Children who have either lost parents because they lost their lives or they've lost their ability to be parents. More kids in the foster care system and in kinship care than ever before. And it's our single greatest threat to economic development. If our workers aren't healthy enough to fill jobs, and we know major manufacturers and others can't fill all their jobs right now, the jobs of the future we want won't come to Kentucky.
I've asked you this question before. What is a victory to you in this case? And you know, if these companies are making billions,
That's right.
and you win millions, that's nothing to them. That writes you $1 million check. It's
Well, and
a drop in the bucket for them.
and-
How do you consider what a victory is?
no judgment, no settlement will ever bring back the people that we've lost. And it's important that we recognize that, because those 5,800 Kentuckians are someone's son, someone's daughter, someone's parents, and there are people that we will never be able to bring back. What I will consider a victory is a substantial recovery that moves Kentucky forward. That while we can't bring back the people that we've lost, we can save the next group, the next generation that's either suffering from addiction or to prevent them from becoming addicted in the first place. We can stop this pill pipeline. We can change prescribing practices, which we work on. We can force companies to be honest in their advertisement about how dangerous these prescription drugs are. In the end, we're fighting for the future. We're fighting for my kids and your viewers' kids. And in the end, a victory will be a substantial change in practices by these companies, but also a substantial recovery that hopefully helps everyone suffering from addiction get the treatment that they need, that helps us be able to fund the type of educational opportunities that will keep kids from ever using in the first place, and that provides recovery services after that initial treatment, because it's hard. And we want to make sure that people get through it, can return to their families, and ultimately raise successful families.
General, I can't recall
Yes.
what the legislature did this year about the use of contingency fee contracts for your office and handling these lawsuits.
Right.
Can you tell us what they did and how this might affect your lawsuits?
It won't affect these lawsuits because they're already under contract, but they passed that contingency fee contract bill that has certain caps on recovery, but that's not going to have any impact on this one.
Where do we stand with your other lawsuits? Can you kind of sum up those where?
Which ones?
The other four, right?
Yes. Oh, of the opioids. Yes.
I'm sorry, yes.
Yes.
This is the fifth, so you have
That's
four
right.
other ones. So can you sum up where they stand?
They're all going through the initial motion practice that starts in the beginning. Of course, none of these companies think they did anything wrong, and that's exactly why we've had to sue them in the first place. So they've either moved to be dismissed, and we're fighting each and every one of those motions, and we believe we'll win each and every one of those motions, or they're trying to get out of Dodge. They're worried about being in a Kentucky court because their practices have harmed Kentucky's families so much. So they're trying to be removed to federal court or ultimately the multi-district litigation. We're going to do everything we can to keep these in Kentucky, but in either forum, we're going to be fighting just as hard. We've got a seat at the table in that national litigation. While we're not a part yet, those talks, while they're ongoing, I've been personally involved in and in the room, and I'm going to make sure that regardless of when and where and how these move forward, that Kentucky is at the front of the line, both in holding these companies accountable, but also in any settlement talks.
Speaking of lawsuits, the one that you're going to court tomorrow on. If you
Yes.
can comment on that.
That is the lawsuit over the illegal and unconstitutional so-called pension reform bill, Senate Bill 151. We filed that lawsuit because the General Assembly went back on a promise that it had made decades ago. The General Assembly had made a promise that if you dedicate your life to public service, if you spend decades teaching our children, protecting our families as a firefighter or police officer, serving the neglected as a social worker, that while we wouldn't pay you nearly enough, we would guarantee you a good retirement. They turned that promise into a contract. They passed that contract into law. When they passed it into law, they made it inviolable under the law, which means it could never be broken. Well, Senate Bill 151 breaks that promise and therefore violates not only the law but the contracts clause of the Kentucky Constitution. In addition, the way they went about it, changing an 11-page sewer bill in the middle of a day into a 291-page pension bill without taking any public comments, without any analysis of whether it would work, and without giving legislators even the time to read it and ramming it through both chambers, that violates numerous provisions of the Constitution that's supposed to prevent bills from becoming laws in that way. Our hearing tomorrow is at 10 a.m. in Franklin Circuit Court. It appears from the court's order what he really wants to talk about is a schedule on our motion for temporary injunction. That injunction asks to freeze any effects of the law until we're able to get it fully argued and get a decision from the trial court. So I expect right now that we will go in, agree to a schedule by which we'll submit written arguments and then come back for oral arguments in front of the court.
General, could also the motion that Governor Bevin's attorneys filed yesterday seeking to have the AG's office removed from this action, could that be taken up as well tomorrow?
It is possible, but under the rules, they had to file that for next Wednesday. I imagine that if the judge even wants arguments on it, then we might schedule that at those times. But let me say that there is no basis for the governor's motion yesterday. The governor is trying to prevent me from fighting for teachers, firefighters, police officers, and social workers, trying to prevent them from having the representation that they deserve to stand up for their rights and ultimately for future educators and future generations. This same exact argument was made in the University of Louisville Board of Trustees case. That was rejected by Franklin Circuit Court. And I want to read one paragraph of that ruling because I think it applies just as much here today. It's the last paragraph for the conclusion. The Attorney General owes a duty of loyalty to the citizens of Kentucky, and he does not serve in the same capacity as private legal counsel to the governor or any other state official. He owes the public a duty of fidelity to the law and his good faith interpretation of that law, and he is bound to advocate vigorously for the enforcement of the Constitution and the statutes of Kentucky. As Kentucky's highest court observed, the source of authority of the Attorney General is the people, who established the government, and his primary obligation is to the people. A similar argument, though it was made in terms of standing, was made in the Beshear v. Bevan case. And the Kentucky Supreme Court was very strong on, in any instance where someone claims that the Attorney General is supposed to be the government's lawyer, his obligation is always first and foremost to the people, and that the Attorney General doesn't just have the ability, but actually has the duty to file suit when the legislature passes an unconstitutional bill.
This motion also seems to raise some issues about your political activity regarding this case, your consultations with House Democrats, your speeches to the teachers' rallies. Have you been too political in this case?
I have the same freedom of speech under the Bill of Rights, which is the same Bill of Rights that pension reform bill violates as anyone else. No, this is one part of an all-out attack on public education. And as Attorney General, I'm going to fight for our public schools, for our teachers, and for our students. My job is to protect the people of Kentucky. And so I'm going to continue to be outspoken on those issues.
Your thoughts on the resignation of Stephen Pruitt yesterday and the 7 new board members appointed by Governor Bevan?
While we're still receiving information on what exactly happened yesterday, I'd say I have at least 3 concerns. Number one is that I believe that these actions continue an all-out assault on public education by the Bevan administration. Number two, it is yet another example of government being conducted behind closed doors and in secret. And number three, it's a direct takeover of the Kentucky Department of Education by the governor. The Department of Education is set up to be an independent group that ultimately, under the law, answers to the legislature, because the legislature is ultimately responsible for public schools in Kentucky. And while some folks have covered the appointees and the rest, what I don't think has gotten enough attention is what happened yesterday was a commissioner who was selected after a nationwide search where people got to comment, in a full vetting process, was removed, and one of Governor Bevan's employees was named the interim commissioner. Just that morning, he was standing behind the governor in one of his press conferences as his employee. That's what's concerning to me, along with the other 2 concerns.
Are there any legal issues there that are of concern to you?
We're still getting information on it, but the independence of the Department of Education is certainly a concern, but that might come about more in action than based on the events from yesterday. I don't necessarily anticipate any legal action on it.
You consider it a return to the bad old days?
Well, I wasn't here during those days, so I can't necessarily compare, but what I'll say is, if you look back at the Rose decision, which changed public education, it found that there was a constitutional mandate to adequately fund our public schools, to provide a good education for our children. It talked about the duties of the legislature. And ultimately, the legislature goes about meeting those obligations through the creation of the Kentucky Department of Education and its operations. If the Department of Education does not operate independently, then I have concerns.
I want to back to the original, talking about these lawsuits and these different courts.
Yes.
Where are they besides McCracken? They're Franklin?
We have filed in Franklin, McCracken, Jefferson, Floyd.
All due respect question.
Sure.
Someone might say that they're filing in different places for political reasons, getting it across the state, publicizing.
Well, I believe that every community has been devastated by this opioid epidemic, and they shouldn't have to drive to Frankfurt to see what we are doing about it. It's harmed their families, and their families deserve to be able to go into a courtroom in their region and watch exactly what is happening. But the other thing from a legal perspective is there have to be a certain number of contacts between a company and the area court is in for them to be sued in that court. And in each and every one of these instances, they have had the contacts in those counties.
A lot of speculation as far as your political future, where you're going to go, running for governor possibly, or AG. I mean, I know it's still early, but kind of where are you at right now?
I'm focused on standing up for the rights of our teachers, our police officers, our firefighters. I'm committed to doing this job to the best of my ability, and everything else can wait for another day.
Are you going to be there tomorrow?
I will be there tomorrow, yes. My plan right now is that I will be at each and every one of these hearings. I promised the people of Kentucky that I was going to represent them, and I'm going to be there to do it. All right. Thank you all very much. Sorry about